sign up and start clapping. And thanks so much for inviting me to come along. It's actually, I have to start with a confession, because it's actually my colleague Lisa Abbott who was originally invited, but she moved to Portugal very sensibly, so couldn't make it. So I'm going to try, in her absence, to do my best to talk on tonight's theme, which is the vocation of a Catholic artist. And I'm just going to turn my phone off. So I just like to tweak the topic of the talk slightly, because as Father Henry said, I've been working for the last 10 years or so as a church artist. So first as an apprentice with Aidan, and now in my own workshop, and in a variety of media, as Father Henry said, painting especially, and carving and mosaic and design. So rather than just speaking in general, I'll be sharing some reflections on the vocation of a Catholic liturgical artist. So an artist who's occupied with making things for the liturgy. And I think it's quite an ugly expression, liturgical artist. So if you have a better alternative, please tell me at the end, because I've been looking for one for quite a while. So this is an example of the kind of thing I make. It's a painting which was commissioned by a parish in Bristol of St. James.
Sorry.
So it's painted in traditional egg tempera, which is literally egg yolk mixed with ground pigment onto this oak panel, which is also being gilded. And it's obviously an image of St. James, and he's holding the parish church who commissioned the icon, and also a pilgrim staff with the badge of Compostela. And because I'm very much a beginner, I'd like to introduce you to two friends, two guides, two kind of true master craftsmen who might be able to help us better than I can by myself reflect on this theme of the Catholic liturgical artist and what their role might be. One is called Theophilus, and he's a German Benedictine monk writing in the 12th century. And the other, Cennino Cennini, was a kind of jobbing painter in Florence in the 15th century. And they both made almost exclusively, as was probably normal in their time, works for the liturgy. And we're so lucky that they both wrote these really detailed manuals of what they do. They kind of set down all the different techniques and recipes with great detail. And I think I'm right in saying that Theophilus' text is the first example we have of a text about manufacturing that was actually written by a practitioner rather than someone who heard about such things secondhand. So it's a really fascinating read. They're full of wonderful detail. These are two craftsmen who love their work, and they absolutely love talking shop. This is an illustration of Theophilus' description of bell casting as he practiced it in his workshop. And as you can probably tell from the drawing, they don't hold any information back. They really share everything they know. And they're full of enthusiasm. Theophilus describes the different types of hammers you need with a sort of relish. And Cennini kind of luxuriates for pages about how to make lapis lazuli pigment. And there are also some kind of interesting, eccentric pieces of advice, like, for example, if you need to quench steel, you might need to decide what to quench the steel in. And Theophilus talks about the merits of using the urine of a half-starved goat versus the urine of a red-faced boy. So if you ever need to decide on that, ask Theophilus. And you also find clues really about the purpose of their work, the final purpose, as well as the processes they use. So I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes more, and I'm going to show you some examples of liturgical artworks, my own and some others. And with Cennini and Theophilus, hopefully we'll kind of triangulate and work out what the vocation of a Catholic liturgical artist might look like. It might be kind of too obvious to say that a liturgical artist is called to work. All art involves labour, and sometimes very much labour indeed. So to begin at the very beginning, it's worth asking about work. What is the origin of work, and why do we work? These I don't know if anyone's been to Verona, but these are the these are the doors of San Zeno Cathedral, which are decorated with 48 panels, cast in bronze, which have scenes from the entire history of salvation. This wonderful idea that to enter the church, you kind of enter through the mysteries of salvation. And they're kind of modelled with quite a lot of freedom and creativity. But there's one panel in particular I'd like to share with you, because I think it speaks to this theme of work. The first thing and most obvious thing we notice are the three magi. They're shown travelling towards Bethlehem, mounted on horseback, wearing crowns and these kind of elegant cloaks which are blowing in the breeze. And below there are other figures, kind of smaller, and travelling in the opposite direction. So the Magi travelling obviously from right to left, and the narrative at the bottom is travelling from left to right. And these figures depict Adam and Eve being expelled from paradise. You can see Adam and Eve in conversation with the serpent, and then eating the apple, the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And then there's an angel with a sword driving them out, and you can see that Adam has a kind of Dick Whittington style stick and bag on his shoulder, so he's become an exile. He's been cast out, and until quite recently I've been really irritated by this panel, because I just don't understand why these two events are depicted on the same panel within this great scheme. It's the only panel in the whole scheme where there are two things shown on the same panel. But I think Cennini and Theophilus have resolved this for me a bit in what they say about the meaning of work. Both Cennini and Theophilus begin these practical treatises with theological reflections on the nature of work. And they both begin by talking about the creation and the fall. This is a wonderful fresco from, I think it's from Catalonia, from a chapel that was destroyed in a fire, or maybe it was bombed in the Second World War. So most of it was destroyed, but we have photographs of the different aspects of the fresco. And this is an angel teaching Adam how to dig. I think it's the only place I've seen an angel digging is in this fresco. So Cennini focuses very much on the fall in his introduction. He paraphrases the book of Genesis and describes work as a sort of punishment for the disobedience of Adam and of Eve. Inasmuch as you have disobeyed the command which God gave you, by your struggles and exertions you shall carry on your lives. And so Cennini goes on. Adam started with a spade, and Eve was spinning. Theophilus's emphasis is a bit different. For Theophilus, work, and he calls it human ingenuity, is mankind's birthright. It's a sort of participation in the wisdom and skill of God's design. And Theophilus describes it even after the disruption of the fall. This intelligence has been transmitted down through the generations, and it's there as a divine inheritance to anyone who will put in the effort to learn how to do these things he talks about. And when I reflect on working in the studio, I can really identify with both these ideas of work. Sometimes work can be a pleasure, an experience of freedom. Other times work is heavy, it feels unfruitful. So I think both Cennini and Theophilus have something to say about work. So this is another depiction of the Magi. It's a carving I made for a church in Austin, Texas. And I began by carving this scene in a panel made from beautiful English oak from from a wonderful sawmill in the Peak District, and then added colour and gilding. So I followed St. Bede's description of the Magi. Melchior, as described by Bede, an old man with white hair and a long beard, who offered gold to the Lord as to a king. The second, Caspar, young with ruddy complexion, honoured him as God by his gift of incense, an oblation worthy of divinity. The third, black-skinned and heavily bearded, named Balthazar, by his gift of myrrh testified to the Son of Man who was to die. So what's the connection between the adoration of the Magi and the fall? What can they tell us about the vocation to work? Well, I think it's something like this. Adam and Eve are expelled from paradise, and the Magi are searching for the Messiah. They're searching for the way home. Adam and Eve are told they must toil and work in exile, but the Magi return to paradise, really. They return to the stable in Bethlehem, to the place where God truly dwells among men. And they don't just come to look, they come bearing gifts. And the gifts they bring are the fruit of human toil as well as the earth. So you might say, in this first encounter between humanity and the Lord incarnate, work is shown not to be ultimately futile, not to be only a punishment, but through the incarnation to find its true end in worship. And it also occurred to me when preparing this that this depiction of Melchior may as well be a depiction of Theophilus, the metal worker, because through the liturgy, the things he made also became an offering to God. And there are actually several works attributed to the author Theophilus which survive, including this magnificent incenser, which I think is in Trier Cathedral in the Treasury, and it's designed to represent the Temple of Solomon. So it's another image of work finding its true end in worship. Let my prayer come before you like incense. So what's the purpose specifically of liturgical art? This is another gospel cover that's also believed to be made by Theophilus, and you can see that he's so sort of obsessed by the different ways of working with metal and precious stones, but sometimes he tries to apply them all to the same object, perhaps even to a fault. There's such a great variety of techniques on show here. The four evangelists made from hammered gold, inset, precious and semi-precious stone, very fine gold rope work and cloisonné enamel, and I'm sure there's a lot else going on if you know about that sort of thing. And I'm really keen not to overload this talk with long quotations, but there's one medium-length quotation that I think is really helpful, and it's from Theophilus. It's from his from one of the prefaces to the 3 books. Henceforth, be fired with greater ingenuity. With all the striving of your mind, hasten to complete whatever is lacking in the house of the Lord, and without which the divine mysteries cannot continue. These are chalices, candlesticks, censers, and all the other things that practical necessity requires for use in ecclesiastical ceremony. If you wish to make these, begin in the following way. So, according to Theophilus, the main calling of a liturgical artist is quite simply to make the things that are practically required for the Mass. Without a chalice, a paten, and an altar, the Eucharist just can't be celebrated. Our worship is physical, it needs stuff. And the liturgical artist's job, according to Theophilus, is simply to make this stuff, without which the divine mysteries cannot continue. And books obviously need covers. But you wouldn't describe this as a utilitarian or probably particularly practical book cover, and you wouldn't describe the doors we just saw from Verona Cathedral as utilitarian either. So there's obviously something else going on here too. The doors are a way into a building and a way to keep people out of a building, but they're also the way into the cathedral, which is to say, sacramentally, they're the way into the kingdom of God. So the liturgical artist's vocation is surely to make stuff to be used in the liturgy, and this stuff has a very practical function and needs to be able to fulfill that function. But because our earthly liturgy is a participation in a heavenly liturgy, they should also make these things into manifestations of invisible things. They should say on the outside what is happening inside. This is a corporal I designed, and which was beautifully stitched by hand by a really skillful embroiderer. So the words, "This is truly my body," was taken obviously from the Eucharistic prayer. And I suppose this is a very direct way in which the outward form of a liturgical object speaks about the inner reality of a sacrament it is furnishing. This, what you're about to see, what you are looking at, is truly my body. And there are also, within this, even practical considerations. So the cross and the corporal, I think I'm right in saying, I could be wrong, is often off-center. And why is that? It's so that the chalice can sit on the corporal on a perfectly flat surface. So there's this interesting kind of combination of things which are practical and things which are, in a way, unnecessary, you might say. This is a detail of the stitching. I think each letter took about an hour and a half to make from silk thread, and because they're slightly raised, and because silk is more reflective than linen, they sort of catch the light. And this is an altar I made for the chapel of a Catholic hermit in North Wales, another liturgical necessity. The chapel is dedicated to St. Peter and St. Paul, and it's in an old farm building, so you can see the wall behind is sort of beautifully uneven and line rendered. And because the hermit lives right next to a sheep farm, and because the sheep file past the chapel every morning, I depicted 2 sheep on the altar. 2 sheep to represent also the apostles Peter and Paul, to whom the chapel is dedicated. And an altar needs to be a minimum size to fit a chalice and a missal and candlesticks and what have you. It needs to be a convenient height, and it also needs to contain a relic. And in this case, instead of setting the relic into the mensa, into the top stone of the altar, we made a cavity within the altar. And inside this cavity there's a relic house, and inside this relic house there are the relics. So on certain feast days, the grill can be removed, the reliquary can be taken out, and the relics venerated. So we might summarize that by saying that the vocation of the liturgical artist is to make stuff for the liturgy. It needs to be practical, but it's also to make these things into sort of manifestations of an invisible reality, the glory of sacramental life specifically. And what becomes really apparent very quickly when you read Cennini and Theophilus, which I hope you're all going to go and do, if I don't bore you too much, is that they consider their work to be part of a tradition. So these techniques are things that have been handed down to them and which they're handing on to the reader. So Cennini begins by talking about his genealogy, almost of the genealogy of his masters, which stretched back to Giotto. And Giotto, of course, was a student of Cimabue, and Cimabue was a student of etc., etc. And he also tells his reader that if they want to set out in the profession of a painter, they need to submit themselves to the direction of a master. And he says, do this as early as you can. Submit yourself to a master as early as you can, and do not leave until you absolutely have to. And in a similar way, there's a wonderful passage in Theophilus where he warns his readers not to guard anything they've learned in his book for themselves. He says, let him not hide his gifts in the purse of envy. It's a wonderful expression, the purse of envy. Nor conceal them in the storeroom of a selfish heart. Let him simply and with a cheerful mind dispense to those who seek. And I was really so blessed not to have had to work everything out for myself, to be an apprentice to a skilled artist. And the initial plan was that I'd help Aidan for 2 weeks with some carving, and I just managed to hang around for 5 or 6 years until finally got rid of me. And then this is a picture taken from about 2016, and you can see in this small workshop all the different things we're working on. There are panel icons on the table. In the background there's a mosaic that's just been finished of St. Michael the Archangel. Aidan's cutting mosaic pieces on a traditional tool for a large mosaic we were making for a church in Texas. And in the background there's a sketch, which I think was part of Earle, if I remember rightly. And you can see all the sort of chaotic paraphernalia of creation. So working within what you could call a living tradition, it's not only about the techniques but also about the style and the content of the work. So back to this altar in Texas, part of the commission, as well as designing the altar frontal with the Adoration of the Magi, was to carve this cross. So this is an altar used for ad orientem worship, and the cross is designed to be just high enough that the head of Christ sort of peaks above the head of the priest celebrating. And there was a fairly open brief for the design, except that he wanted a cross carved in relief and that this carving should be painted. So we spoke about different options, and we decided to draw on some early depictions of the Crucifixion. This is one of the earliest, actually. You've probably seen it. It's from a 6th century illuminated gospel that was discovered in what is now Syria. And it's part of an early tradition of depicting Christ on the cross wearing this interesting purple robe with gold bands. And you can see at the bottom there's scenes about the resurrection, the angel at the tomb, and Christ appearing to the Marys in the garden. And the soldiers kind of bound up beneath the empty tomb. So another example of this tradition from fresco in Santa Maria Antigua. I'm not sure, I think it's 8th century, so it's a couple of centuries after the manuscript. Probably others to be able to tell me differently. But so why is the Lord shown in this garment? It's actually a garment with a very specific history and purpose. And when the Queen was anointed, crowned, she was actually wearing initially this colobium, it's called. It's an undergarment that was used during the anointing of a king or a queen. And the colour of the garment in the last image, purple, and I think this might be purple too if we saw it in real life. I think it might be a bad reproduction. Was a colour preserved in the ancient world for emperors. And you might recognise it today as the dalmatic, the vestment worn by a deacon during Mass. And I think it also sort of had a parallel divergence. It became an alb. So it's a garment which is about the ordination of a king, and also about a kind of priestly act. So it seemed an especially fitting way of depicting the Lord for an altar crucifix. So begin by making a design to show the commissioner, and instead of traditional kind of INRI at the top of the cross, we decided to have the King of Glory from Psalm 24. Who is he, the King of Glory? To kind of express this paradox of the crucifixion as the moment of glory. And so things get more physical, moving from pencils and emails to mallets and chisels. So here's the crucifix being made at an early stage from the same material as the carving of the Magi, from English oak, which is sort of roughed out with power tools. So slightly later stage, and then towards the end carved by hand. So the power tools take about a week, and then the carving by hand, I think, took about a month. I can't remember. So this is a detail of the finished carving. So unlike the two ancient prototypes we drew on, Christ is shown dead on the cross with his eyes closed. But it was also our intention to show him at peace on the cross, because true peace is doing the will of the Father, and also to have these kind of open hands which suggest an embrace as well as the agony of the crucifixion. There's the Saint Athanasius asks, why did the Lord have to die upon a cross specifically? Why did he have to die in this way? And one of the answers he gives is that he had to die with his arms stretched out to embrace the whole cosmos. So obviously when you're taking pictures in your workshop, you can set up the lighting to make your work look as nice as you like. But in practice, the crucifix was going to be used in all sorts of different lights, on the altar, but also in processions. And so in a bad light from the back of a church, or even quite close to it, would just completely disappear. So it was really important for the parish that it should be painted. So here's an example of the painted work. But I tried not to kind of overdo it, so you can still see the grain of the wood, the beautiful grain coming through. Another painted crucifix for the Bader College. I suppose just showing this as an example of drawing on tradition. So it went to a seminary in Rome, and we spoke about the different apse mosaics in Rome and drawing the elements. So in the Church of San Clemente, there's an amazing 6th century apse, and beneath the cross there are these deer drinking from the 4 rivers of paradise. And above the whole apse there's a hand holding the wreath, and it's the hand of the Father holding the wreath of victory. And somebody asked me the other day if it was a brioche, which wasn't very encouraging. But it's not a brioche, it's the crown of victory. It's a sort of Roman victory wreath. What kind of processes is a liturgical artist involved in? Whether Cennini and Theophilus are discussing how to quench your tools, or how to make pigments for fresco painting, or glue from animal hide, or stained glass, or a pipe organ, they're both manifestly people who are very engaged with their materials. They seem to have their hands sort of in the earth, and they love to explore the properties of each material, each raw material they're working with, and in that way you could say they're quite grounded. You could say that they're humble, because the root of the word humility is obviously the word humus, not the food, humus,
yeah.
which means earth. So to be humble means to be rooted in the earth. So Cennini and Theophilus are very much people who are rooted in the earth, and there's a sort of link between this fresco of Adam digging, or being taught to dig, and all the other processes that craftsman uses, because all these things, whether it's your pigments or ores to make metal, come from in the earth. So there's a sense of this being rooted in the earth, and of deep engagement with the materials. So I mean, for example, to make lapis lazuli, grinding from stone, and then mixing with egg yolk, which is the binder. And this is a fresco from the same Catalonian chapel we saw earlier, and it's obviously Noah building the ark. I guess I'd like to say that there's a quite precious semi-mystical picture of icon painting that's sort of being promoted, that's about kind of contemplation and levitation almost. But actually, making this work is physical, and it's also quite urgent work. It's like Noah building the ark when the waters are rising above him. It's not some kind of a retreat from reality, it's a deep engagement with it. And it's a work that engages the whole person. It's a work of blood and sweat and tears, of heart, head and hands. And just like the ark, most of our paintings begin with the construction of these wooden panels. So even the painting itself is a sort of physical object. So if the Wi-Fi works, which I hope it will, I want to show you a short time-lapse animation of a panel being made for quite a complex triptych, so that you can see this process of just building the panel playing out and what it involves. I'll see if it works. I might try and slow it down. So beginning with chunks of wood, which are then glued together. And in the overall shape cut out with a power tool, a router. So wood is a living thing, and it wants to kind of expand and contract, so you have to put these battens in, which aren't fixed but allow the panel to move. And then this is the carving out of the panel to make kind of moulding around each section of the triptych, beginning with a power tool. And then as you get closer to the final surface, using hand tools, using chisels. And after this is all carved, a cloth is added onto the whole surface, and then we add about 15 layers of gesso. And this gesso is then polished to a very high degree, and that makes a beautiful white surface to paint on, which is sort of absorbent. And this is just a wonderful surface. This is a finished triptych after painting and gilding. So it's actually an altarpiece dedicated to the martyrs of Lancaster. So it's a painting which has a liturgical function. It's in a side chapel, and on the feast day of the Lancaster martyrs, it's used to celebrate Mass. So a detail. The Lancaster martyrs have the greatest names. Robert Nutter, which is fantastic. There are others too. So I've got another animation of a cross being painted. So after the panel has been made and gesso has been added, this is the process of painting with egg tempera, which, a bit unlike oil, involves building up many layers of paint. And the idea is that the surface of the gesso, which is this brilliant white, shows through all the subsequent layers, so that if you don't overdo it, the painting has a sort of luminosity underneath it. So I'll just play this, and I think I'll slow it down too. Oh. Yeah. Oh. Okay, start again. So underpainting, the kind of drawing that goes under the painting, and then adding bold before gilding. And then the process I talked about of building up layers of paint, going all the way to the highlights, so the image gradually emerges. And then adding various decorations and lettering. And that's the finished work. So a detail from a cross I painted last year. And on either side of Christ there's this technique which Cennini describes, where you paint onto a gilded surface in two different colours, or more if you like, so red and blue, and then you scratch back these surfaces to reveal the gold, which creates this sort of geometric design with gold underneath. And this is a small icon I painted last year for someone in Leeds, actually. And around Christ, you see different elements from the creation: mountains, trees, and flowers. In him all things were made, and in him all things hold together. So you could say that maybe part of the vocation of a liturgical artist, and I'm waiting for a better phrase than that, is to use all these things from creation, these things which have been made through Christ and are sustained by God, and to use them and sort of give them back to him in a way, using them skillfully to give him glory, especially by serving a liturgical function. So one of the first things that drew me to this type of work was seeing the amazing Romanesque carvings in cathedrals in France, like Autun and Vézelay. And what I really love about them is this sense of play and freedom. They're perfectly sort of faithful to what they're depicting, and presumably faithful to the practical task they've been given. But there's also this sense of sort of creativity and humour. So this is obviously an angel of a carving, which is a capital of an angel waking up the three wise men and pointing to the Star of Bethlehem. Somebody, I think it was Kenneth Clark in Civilization, he described the Romanesque carvers who travelled around Europe in the age of the cathedrals as a school of dolphins. A school of dolphins, so they were sort of full of this exuberant, playful energy. This is a mosaic of St. Michael I made towards the end of my time in Aidan's studio. And when you read Cennini and Theophilus, you can't help but seeing that they take great pleasure and they're just delighted by their work. And Cennini often will say things like, this process ought to be carried out with great pleasure and great delight. And he's very keen on this word delight. And sometimes he describes the technique and says something like, and now you can do whatever you fancy. And likewise, Theophilus has a similar turn of phrase, and he often says, do whatever you wish with this technique. So I think it would be misleading to describe the tradition of iconography as a sort of something containing many rules. If there is some great big book of rules, I haven't found it yet. I think there's a quality in the best work, and it's a quality of delight and playfulness. So most conversations about liturgical art arrive at the question of money quite quickly, and that's normally the end of the conversation. And this will be the end of the talk, this last very brief point, so stay with me just for a bit longer. Here's a devotional work attributed to Cennini. I don't know if anyone knows any toddlers at the moment, but this is a very familiar toddler thing to do if you look at Christ and Mary. So I really hope you're tempted to read Theophilus and Cennini, and a really wonderful text. And there's something that I especially appreciate about Cennini, because he's not a monk; he's a jobbing painter. And in his manual, he kind of combines this sort of straightforward piety with sound business advice in the same sentence. So he actually ends the work with a prayer that through this work may you keep your family in this world. So through this work may you earn a living so that you can support your family. And his text is peppered with advice about money, which, if you know people that are self-employed, is quite a common thing. Theophilus less so, probably because he was a monk. And Cellini doesn't really describe his vocation, his work as a vocation. He describes it as a profession, and maybe there's a sort of humility and a good sense in that. And I'd like to finish with one final short quote from the Craftsman's Handbook, which combines technical knowledge, business sense, and piety. That seems to me to sum up something of the vocation, or what Cellini would call the profession of the liturgical artist. He's just complained about some other craftsmen who aren't doing things right. And then he says, I give you this urgent advice, to make an effort always to embellish with fine gold and with good colours, especially in the figure of Our Lady. Sorry, he sounds like a very pious man. And if you wish to tell me that a poor person cannot afford the outlay, I answer that if you do your work well and spend time on your jobs and use good colours, you will get such a good reputation that a wealthy person will come to compensate you for the poor one. And your standing will be so good that if a master is getting 1 ducat for a figure, you will be offered 2. As the old saying goes, good work, good pay. So a bit more worldly. But then he finishes on a redemptive note. And even if you are not adequately paid, God and Our Lady will reward you for it, body and soul. So that's the end.